It was the last night of our 5-day, 4-night camping trip deep in the woods, and I had started to finally feel like I was getting used to everything. The quiet, the sounds, the routines of camp life. This trip had been my first real experience with camping, and although the first couple of nights had left me feeling unsure and a little uneasy, by the 4th day I felt like I had earned some confidence. We'd hiked miles through the forest, climbed through uneven ground, crossed a shallow stream on wet rocks, and followed trails that were only half there in places. It had been hard, but it felt good. We'd set up our final camp with a view over a wide open stretch of land that had clearly burned in a wildfire not long ago. Charred stumps stuck out of the ground here and there, and the trees that still stood were spaced out and bare, some blackened halfway up, like reminders of what had happened. It wasn't ugly though, not at all. With the full moon above it, that clearing looked silver and calm and kind of beautiful. That openness was part of the reason we'd picked the spot. After so many days in thick woods, where the trees pressed in on every side and you couldn't see 10 feet off the trail, it felt like a relief to have a view again. We could see the ridges in the distance, see where the forest had been thinned, and there was enough visibility to keep an eye out for anything that might wander into camp. We weren't expecting trouble, but it still gave a sense of safety. It felt like we had room to breathe. The day had been uneventful in the best way. We ate what little food we had left, set up the tents, rolled out our sleeping pads, and sat around the fire until it burned low and the sky darkened into that kind of blue that isn't quite night yet, but isn't really evening anymore either. The moon came up over the ridge early. I remember noticing how bright it was. It almost washed out the stars. Everything had that pale glow to it, like the ground itself had turned silver. We didn't need headlamps to see. You could look out across the clearing and pick out every stump, every bend in the undergrowth, every little rock. We turned in early, exhausted from the hike. The wind barely moved. The only sound was the usual forest hum, low and quiet, like everything had settled in for the night just like we had. I remember thinking how nice it was to sleep with all that space around me, how I could look out the tent window and see clear across the open area, how nothing could sneak up on us here without being seen. It made me feel safer, but that feeling didn't last. I woke up around 1 a.m. to a sound I didn't recognize. Not something loud, but sharp enough to slice right through the quiet. It was a call, short and harsh. I didn't know it at the time, but I'd later learn it was the sound of a bird, probably a Steller's jay or maybe a scrub jay, doing a warning call. And it wasn't just once. It happened again and again. A pause of maybe 30 seconds, sometimes a minute. Then the same loud call, clear and urgent. Not a song, not random noise, a deliberate sound, like it was saying something, like it wanted to be heard. At first, I just lay there, not really awake yet, assuming it was nothing. Birds make noise. The woods make noise. This was just part of it. But then it kept going. And when I finally sat up and really listened, I noticed something that made my stomach go tight. Every time the bird called, it seemed to be coming from a slightly different spot. Still close, still the same general direction, but shifting. And underneath it, quieter, harder to catch at first, there were other sounds. Something was moving. It wasn't wind. It wasn't branches creaking or leaves rustling high up in the trees. It was lower than that, closer. A steady, slow crackling of sticks under weight. Something heavy enough to snap dry brush. Then silence. Then another few steps. Then nothing again. I held my breath without meaning to. I was wide awake now, heart starting to beat faster, head filling up with noise. It circled once, I think. That's what it felt like. I could hear it moving slowly across the edge of the clearing, always just outside the tent. Not close enough to see a shape, but not far enough to ignore. It wasn't rushing. It wasn't charging or stomping, but it wasn't small either. It was heavy enough to make the ground sound under it. Every once in a while, I'd hear the brush drag or a bush sway back after something passed by it. Then the bird would call again. Sharp, assertive, always near wherever the movement came from. I sat in the tent, knees pulled in, hands gripped on the sides of the sleeping bag, trying not to breathe too loud. I looked out the mesh window but saw nothing. The moon lit up the whole clearing. I could see the fallen logs, the outline of my pack near the tree, even the slope where the forest picked back up on the far side. But no movement, no figure, just sound. Every minute or so, a stick would snap, something brushing against a branch. Then quiet. The bird would call again. Kept going. Not just for a few minutes, for hours. I didn't sleep at all. I stayed frozen there, eyes open, trying to convince myself it was nothing. A deer maybe, or a raccoon. But the longer it went, the less sense that made. Raccoons don't move like that. They rustle, they dig, they scamper. This wasn't scampering. This was pacing. I thought about unzipping the tent and looking out fully, but I couldn't do it. I didn't want to risk making a sound. I didn't want whatever was out there to know I was awake. I just sat still, every muscle in my body clenched, watching, listening. The night didn't feel calm anymore. It felt tense. Like something was off, like the woods were holding their breath too. The bird eventually moved off, or maybe it just stopped calling. But the movement didn't. Kept going around the tent, every so often, slow and steady. I'd hear it shift from one side to another. Never close enough to see clearly, but never far. Like it knew where we were. Like it was watching. The worst part wasn't the noise though. It was the fact that I never saw anything. Not even a shadow. And with the moon that bright, it felt like I should have. I kept expecting a shape to cross into the open, to give me something, anything to identify. But there was nothing. At one point, I thought I saw a branch move near the edge of the tree line, like something had brushed it, but I couldn't be sure. It might have been wind. It might have been nothing. My eyes were playing tricks on me. My head was so full of tension by then that I didn't trust what I was seeing or hearing. I started thinking maybe it was a bear. That made the most sense. A black bear, maybe curious, maybe just wandering. Maybe it had caught our scent and was trying to figure out what we were. It didn't seem aggressive. It hadn't charged. It hadn't come into the tent. But it also hadn't left. It had stayed there, circling, staying close. I'd read that bears sometimes do that, especially young ones or ones that aren't used to humans. They don't always run off. They sometimes just observe, and that made it worse. The idea that something was just out there, close enough to hear me breathe, maybe see me through the mesh, deciding what to do. By the time the first signs of morning started to show, I felt like I was vibrating. My teeth chattered even though it wasn't cold. My hands had gone numb from how tightly I'd been gripping my sleeping bag. My legs ached from how stiff I'd held myself. Every noise had been a jolt. Every minute had felt like 10. When the sky finally started to lighten, just a shade of gray creeping into the black, I felt like crying. The bird was gone. The movement had stopped sometime around then, or maybe I just couldn't hear it anymore through the thick fog in my head. I didn't get out right away. I waited until the light was strong enough to really see. Then I slowly unzipped the tent, heart hammering, breath held, and looked out. Nothing. No tracks I could see. No animal. Just the quiet clearing and the bare old trunks. But that didn't mean it hadn't been there. I don't know what it was. I'll never know. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe it was something else. All I know is that something walked around our camp that night. Something big enough to move brush, snap sticks, and wake a bird into calling out every few minutes for hours. And I was alone in my fear. Nobody else in the group heard it. They all slept through it somehow. They woke up talking about breakfast, about the hike out, about how beautiful the morning was. And I just nodded, exhausted, rattled, still shaking a little from a night that felt like it had lasted forever. I didn't tell them how scared I was. I didn't say a word. I just packed up my gear and kept moving, trying not to look back over my shoulder as we left the clearing behind. That trip taught me something, not about animals or camping or wilderness survival, but about how it feels when you're completely alone with fear, how the mind races, how silence becomes noise, how the woods feel different at night than they ever do during the day, and how even when nothing happens, no attack, no injury, no visible danger, you can still come out of it knowing for sure that something was there, watching, waiting, just close enough to hear, but never close enough to see. And that's what stuck with me. Not the silence, not even the fear, the not knowing, the way the woods never told me what it was. I had been planning that trip for a few months. It was going to be my break from everything, the noise, the screens, the routines. I'd picked a spot in the northern part of the state, about 2 hours' drive from home. A small campground tucked in the edge of a national forest, with trails leading deeper into the backcountry. I was going to do it solo, just me, my gear, and a few days of quiet in the woods. It would be my first time doing a real multi-day camping trip alone. The first 2 nights were great. I got used to the silence, which wasn't truly silent at all, but full of different noises than what I was used to. Birds calling at dawn, the soft whoosh of wind moving through the trees, squirrels skittering across the undergrowth, even the occasional creak from branches overhead. I was nervous the first night, sure, but by the second evening, I was already starting to settle in. I'd been following a loop trail that worked its way up into the hills, setting up camp at different spots each night. By the third day, I was tired but happy, finding a rhythm in hiking, setting up camp, boiling water, and sitting still with the trees all around. There wasn't any cell signal out there. I didn't bring anything to distract myself. I just wanted the quiet, to be alone, to prove to myself that I could do this. The fourth night, my last night out, I set up camp in a small flat area not far from a long slope that dropped into a valley. The site had a wide open view, probably because a wildfire had swept through the area a few years back. The trees were thinner there, many burned black or snapped halfway up. Underneath, low brush and wild grasses had started to grow back. It made the place feel more open than the other campsites, and I could see far in most directions. The sun set behind the hill, and the sky turned deep orange before fading to purple and then black. The moon was nearly full, and the whole place lit up once my eyes adjusted. I crawled into my tent around 9 or 10. I'd already eaten, packed up my food, and stashed it in the bare canister about 100 feet from camp, well away from the tent. I double-checked everything as I always did. No food or scented items inside, just clothes, water, and my sleeping bag. The air was cool and still. I zipped the tent closed, slipped into the bag, and laid there for a while, listening to the wind brush through the grass. At some point, I must have drifted off. When I woke up, everything was dead quiet. I didn't know what time it was, but it was definitely past midnight. The moonlight was so bright I could clearly see the outline of my tent walls and even the shadows of the guy lines stretching outward. I remember thinking that it was unusually quiet. No wind, no bugs, just silence. Then I heard it, sniffing, right above my head. Not the kind of quick sniffs a dog might make when it's curious. These were slow, heavy, almost wet-sounding. A deep inhale, then another. I stopped breathing. I was frozen in place. My heart was pounding so fast I could feel it in my neck. The noise was so close I could feel the vibrations in the tent fabric, like something warm and alive was just on the other side. My brain didn't want to accept what was happening at first. I thought maybe it was a dream, but the sound kept going. Slow sniffs along the top edge of the tent, right where my head was. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. All I could think was bear. That was it. Nothing else made sense. No raccoon or deer was going to sniff around a tent like that, not with that size or that breathing. I tried to calm myself, but I was shaking. I mean, really shaking, like my whole body was buzzing. I felt like if I moved even a little, whatever it was would hear it and react. I didn't want to startle it. I didn't know what it would do. I didn't even want to think about what would happen if it got more curious. Kept going, moving slowly around the side of the tent, still sniffing. Then I heard a soft huff. Not a growl, not loud, but a clear sound of something exhaling forcefully. It was testing the air. Then a few seconds of silence. Then I heard movement in the brush, slow, deliberate steps, the kind that crack twigs and shift the weight of a large animal against dry leaves. It circled the tent. I don't know how long I laid there. It felt like hours. I kept telling myself it would leave, that it was just curious and would move on. But it didn't. I heard it walking slowly around the tent again, like it was sniffing out the perimeter. Every once in a while, it stopped, and I could hear it breathing. There were moments when I felt its presence so close that it almost felt like the tent wall was being pressed in slightly, like a paw was just short of touching the fabric. That's when the thought hit me. If it pushes in, the only thing between me and it is a few millimeters of nylon. I didn't have anything in there with me. No food, no scented gear. Just my sleeping bag and my flashlight. My bear spray was in the side pocket of my pack, which was outside, right near the tent flap. No way I could reach it. I didn't even want to try. I don't know what finally made me do it, but after the second full circle it made, I caught my breath, lifted my hands up above my chest, and clapped hard just once. The sound echoed in the tent like a gunshot. I immediately yelled, loud, clear, and deep, "Go away, bear!" My voice cracked a little. My throat was dry. I was so scared I barely recognized my own voice. I heard a thump, like something heavy taking a step back. Then another, then crashing. Not fast, but definitely leaving. Brush snapping, heavy paws thudding against dirt and fallen branches. I didn't move. I didn't even unzip the tent to look. I just laid there, heart thudding in my ears, hands clenched into fists. I stayed like that until the first light started to show in the sky. The sounds didn't return. The sniffing didn't come back. But sleep never did either. I watched the fabric of the tent slowly change from blue-gray to light orange as the sun came up. I finally sat up, unzipped the tent, and looked out. Nothing, just still trees and sunlit grass. I walked out stiff-legged, still shaken, still not totally sure it was over. The air was cold and clean. Birds had started to chirp again. A few feet away, I found a few deep tracks in the dirt. Wide paw prints, much too big to be a dog, and no claw marks to make it a cougar. For toes, thick pads. It had been a black bear. The rest of camp was untouched. The bear canister was undisturbed. My pack was fine. It hadn't torn anything, hadn't broken into anything. It had just sniffed, maybe curious, maybe hoping for something to eat. But it never got aggressive. Just close, way too close. I packed everything up in silence. I didn't eat. I didn't stop to enjoy the morning. I just wanted to get back to the trailhead. The hike out took about 2 hours, maybe a little less. The whole way, I kept looking over my shoulder, listening harder than I'd ever listened before. Back at my car, I tossed my gear in and sat behind the wheel for a while before starting it. I didn't feel relief at first. I felt numb, like I'd come close to something I wasn't really prepared for. The bear didn't do anything wrong. It was just doing what bears do. But being that close to something wild, something that powerful, with nothing but fabric between us, that changes you a little. That night, back home, I finally slept. Took a while, but I did. And even now, when I think about camping, I still love it. I still go, but I pack differently. I set up differently. I know what it's like now to have something sniffing your head through a tent wall at 2 in the morning. And I don't think I'll ever forget the sound of that first breath. I'd spent most of my life camping and hiking all across North America. Growing up in Montana, then later living in Idaho and Colorado, I was used to the idea that apex predators were always part of the backdrop out there. It was just something I learned to live with. You make noise on trails, keep your food sealed up right, and know what signs to look for. That was just normal. But I'll be honest, no matter how used to it you think you are, there are some nights out there that shift your understanding of fear in a way that lingers long after you've packed up and gone home. This trip started like so many others. It was a 5-day backpacking loop through a stretch of national forest in western Montana, not far from the Bob Marshall Wilderness. I had a friend visiting from overseas, someone I'd met during a trail work program years back. She was from Australia. When I pitched the idea of a real backcountry trip, she jumped at it, full of excitement about seeing bears and wolves and whatever else you Americans have running around. She laughed about how everyone says Australia is dangerous, but at least they don't have things like cougars or grizzlies. At the time, I laughed too. The route was nothing technical, but it was remote. No cell service, no close ranger stations, and barely marked trails in places. That's what made it so appealing. We were both fit, experienced, and well-prepared. We had bear spray, a satellite communicator, a good first aid kit, and knew how to store our food properly. The plan was to loop through several valleys, camp near lakes or streams each night, and take our time. It was late summer, warm days, cool nights, and the kind of dry air that carries sound far and clear in the mornings. Ideal weather, maybe a little too ideal. The first 2 days went by smooth. We saw mule deer, some elk, heard coyotes calling from one of the ridges at night, but nothing out of the ordinary. We cooked simple meals, filtered water from streams, kept the camp clean. She kept commenting on how different it was from camping back home. No kangaroos, no weird birds, just the looming sense that something bigger might be watching you from the trees. It didn't seem to bother her, though. Not then. On the third night, we camped in a wide, flat area beside a shallow river. There were a few old fire rings, so clearly others had camped here before. A long meadow stretched along the opposite bank, framed by thick pine and spruce. We set the tent a little ways from the water, hung the food bags at a distance, and went to bed after dark set in. It was quiet, no wind, just the faint sounds of the river and the occasional clicking of insects. I woke sometime after midnight, no dreams, just wide awake, like my body had decided something wasn't right before I'd had time to think. I listened for a few seconds, trying to figure out what had changed. Then I heard it, a rustling sound off to the left, somewhere past the tent. Something moving slowly through brush and grass. A pause, then another movement. At first I thought it was deer, maybe an elk, but the steps were careful, not clumsy, heavy but slow. I sat up, unzipped the tent door just enough to see out without making much noise. The moonlight was faint, but enough to see the glint of the river. My eyes adjusted slowly. Then I saw them. 3 shapes, just silhouettes at first, maybe 30 or 40 feet away near the river. They weren't moving much, just standing still. One of them shifted, and that's when I saw the flash. A glint of light caught in a pair of eyes. Then another. 3 sets, spaced apart. I squinted, heart picking up speed. Bears. I could see the way they were spaced. One larger, the other 2 slightly smaller. A sow and 2 older cubs, maybe 2 years old. They weren't far from our food hang. Maybe they smelled it, or maybe they were just curious. But they were staring in our direction, watching us. I didn't wake her yet, just sat there quietly, watching, trying to think. We hadn't left anything near the tent. No food, no toothpaste, nothing scented. I kept bear spray within reach and stayed still, hoping they'd lose interest. But they didn't. They just stood there for a long time. Occasionally one would shift its weight, lower its head, then raise it again. They were so still, otherwise it was eerie. Eventually I unzipped the fly enough to slip out. I didn't want them getting any closer without us being ready. I grabbed the headlamp, kept it angled low, and stepped around to the front of the tent. That's when she woke up, probably from the movement or the slight sound of the zipper. She asked if something was wrong, and I just nodded once, slow, and motioned for her to come out. I whispered that there were bears nearby. She didn't panic, just went quiet and serious. We both knew what we were supposed to do. We made some noise, shouted a little, banged trekking poles together. The sound echoed off the trees. I thought that would do it. Usually it does. They run. Even curious bears don't like being around active humans. But not this time. They didn't leave. They just watched. We kept it up. Noise, movement, headlamps flashing side to side. We raised our arms, stepped out away from the tent to show we were big. All the stuff you're supposed to do. Still, they didn't go. One of the cubs, I say cub, but it was nearly grown, stepped closer to the river. Slow, deliberate. It was clear then that they weren't afraid. Not really. That's what changed everything. Most bears will back off, but these ones, they had the calm confidence of animals that had done this before. Like they knew what we were and didn't see it as a threat. That's a different kind of feeling. It's not panic. It's cold, settling dread. The kind that makes you think in strict, mechanical steps. No emotion, just focus. I whispered that we needed to leave. She agreed. No hesitation. We packed up fast. Not everything, just the essentials. Tent came down with shaking hands. Sleeping bags crammed into packs. Food bags stayed where they were. We weren't risking it. I put on my pack, clipped everything tight, and kept one hand near the bear spray. They were still there, still watching. No charge, no bluff, just steady interest. we started hiking by headlamp. No trail, just bushwhacking up away from the water toward the main route we'd come in on. It was steep in places, loose with rocks, but we didn't stop. Not even when the terrain got rough. I kept checking behind us. No eyes, no movement. Still, I couldn't shake the thought that they might follow. Eventually, we hit the main trail. That familiar packed dirt was the biggest relief I've felt in years. We didn't talk, just kept moving, step after step, flashlight beams swinging. I checked our map once. We had about 6 miles to the trailhead. Doable, even tired. But then we saw tracks. I stopped when I spotted them. Fresh, not ours. Bear tracks, wide and clear, heading the same direction we were going. The size told me it wasn't just one of the cubs. We followed them for nearly half a mile before they veered off into the woods. Never saw the bear that made them, but the idea of crossing paths in the dark kept us moving even faster. Around 4 a.m., we reached the trailhead. The sky was just starting to shift, that faint blue that comes before sunrise. We sat on the edge of the gravel lot for a while, drank water, ate some trail mix. No words, just sat there, absorbing the fact that we'd made it out. Later, driving back into town, she said she finally understood the difference. Australia had snakes, spiders, sharks, things that strike fast, dangerous but not personal. North America had something else. Animals that watched, studied, and sometimes didn't care that you were human. There's a silence to that kind of threat. It doesn't lunge out of nowhere. Stands there waiting to see what you'll do. We never figured out exactly why those bears didn't leave. Maybe they'd been fed by someone in the past. Maybe they were just too used to campsites. Or maybe they were testing boundaries, seeing what they could get away with. That was the last night of that trip. We didn't camp again after that. Just finished out the miles, stayed in a small motel, and flew her home a few days later. She still talks about it sometimes. Says it was the first time she ever felt like she wasn't the top of the food chain. And honestly, I think that's what stuck with me too. You spend enough time out there and it's easy to forget. You get used to being the one with the map, the gear, the plan. But sometimes the forest reminds you, none of that matters when something out there doesn't see you as different from anything else. That night, those bears didn't bluff. They didn't growl, didn't charge, didn't flee. They just stood there and waited. And that was enough to send us packing. It was the most direct lesson I've ever had in humility. And I don't think I'll ever camp the same way again. Backpacking in Colorado had always been something I looked forward to all year. There was something about getting away from the noise of everything, cell service, traffic, even regular electricity, that helped clear my head in a way nothing else could. It was just me, one close friend, a few days of food, and miles of quiet trail stretching ahead. We'd been planning this particular trip for a while. A 5-day loop through some of the higher elevation trails west of Buena Vista, camping along creeks and passes, climbing ridges that overlooked entire valleys below. It wasn't our first trip, not by a long shot. We both had years of backpacking experience and knew the usual protocol. Store food properly, don't hike in the dark if you can help it, watch your step near loose rocks and drop-offs, and always keep an eye out for wildlife, especially bears. The whole trip had gone about as smoothly as you could ask for, considering the terrain. We'd had a mix of sun and short rain bursts, nothing extreme, and aside from one ankle scrape and a leaky valve on my sleeping pad, everything had been uneventful in the best way. The only hint of something off came on the second to last night. We'd found a decent site a few hundred yards off the main trail, tucked beside a low bend in a small river. It was shaded, soft ground, and open enough to feel safe, but not so open that it felt exposed. We had our bear bags strung up far enough away, and everything smelled clean. No food scraps, no wrappers lying around. That evening, while the sun was going down, we thought we saw movement across the water, just where the trees started getting dense. It wasn't close, but something big enough caught our attention. A shape between the trunks. When the light hit it just right, we saw a faint flicker, a reflection, the kind that doesn't move like the glint off wet leaves. We didn't panic. We just stood still and watched. After a while, the shapes disappeared. Could have been deer, we figured. Maybe a lone elk passing through. Whatever it was, It hadn't made any noise and hadn't come closer. That was enough to put a little edge on our nerves, but we still went to sleep without much worry. We'd had visitors before. Most of the time, animals don't want anything to do with people. You make a little noise, they leave. It's practically a rule. The next day, we packed up and hiked through some steep, exposed ridges before dropping down into the valley where we planned to spend our final night. This area was quieter. We hadn't seen another hiker in more than a day by that point. The trail was thinner, less used, but not completely gone. We followed a narrow path down to a broad, flat spot that overlooked a small stream. It was picture perfect. Low shrubs, scattered trees, a rocky outcrop nearby we could use for sitting, and the steady sound of water running through smooth stone. We set up camp, made a modest dinner of freeze-dried rice and beans, and spent the last bit of light talking quietly while watching the sky go from pink to deep purple. It got cold faster than we expected. The air felt thinner at that elevation, and it had a dampness to it. We both crawled into our tents early. I remember lying there for a while, watching my breath rise in the beam of my headlamp, then clicking it off and closing my eyes. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I first opened my eyes again. Couldn't have been more than a few hours. The tent was completely black inside. There wasn't even moonlight reaching us, just the sound of the stream nearby and the soft creaking of trees in the wind. But then I noticed something. It was faint, like a rhythm I couldn't quite place. A shuffle, not like a branch falling or the normal crack of forest sounds. It was too steady, too controlled. I froze, listening harder. Then I saw it. The slightest glow of two small reflections down by the creek. Not far, just past the line of trees maybe 50 feet out. The reflections blinked and shifted. Then two more appeared next to them, lower to the ground, close together. I knew immediately what it was. Black bears. They were standing almost perfectly still. Their eyes were what gave them away, that faint mirror flash when the light caught them just right. I didn't move. I didn't breathe, just waited. Eventually, I heard the soft rustle of their steps through the brush, coming closer. Not fast, not aggressive, just curious. That somehow made it worse. Curiosity meant they weren't scared. Curiosity meant they might not just wander off like most do. I quietly unzipped the sleeping bag and slid out of the tent as slowly as I could. My friend had already seen them too. I could see the beam of his headlamp flicker from inside his tent, angled low. We didn't need to say anything. We both knew the protocol. Make noise, look big, don't panic. Just do what you've practiced a dozen times before. We both turned on our lights and started yelling. Not screaming, just making our presence clear, loud bursts of noise, hands waving over our heads. The bears froze. The big one in front, probably the mother, stood there looking right at us. I could see her body, the way she shifted her weight between her front paws. She wasn't backing off. She didn't even flinch. And the two smaller ones behind her, likely older cubs, just stood beside her like they'd done it before. We kept shouting, clapping, stomping. It didn't matter. She didn't care. She took a step forward. My heart was pounding. I could feel my fingers go cold, like my body was pulling blood back to the core. I kept thinking, this isn't supposed to happen. They're supposed to run. That's how it always goes. Except this time, they weren't. Another step. That was enough. We backed up slowly, keeping our lights pointed at them, trying not to trip. The campsite was small and cluttered. We hadn't expected to have to move fast, especially not at night. We moved toward the edge of the trees where our tent gear and food were hung. There was no time to be picky. We stuffed what we could into our packs. Sleeping bags, pads, jackets. My fingers were shaking so bad I could barely clip the buckles. The bears didn't charge. They didn't run either. They just kept coming, sniffing around the edges of where we'd been, checking things out. We didn't wait any longer. We strapped on what we could, left what we couldn't, and hit the trail back the way we'd come. Headlamps on, feet crunching down the cold, narrow path. Neither of us spoke. It wasn't a silence of calm. It was tension, held in our throats like a coiled spring. Every few minutes we'd stop and listen, checking behind us, making sure we weren't being followed. The trail was harder to follow at night than we expected. Shadows turned simple dips in the path into confusing gaps. Trees looked the same. Every turn felt like maybe we'd passed it already, but we kept going. The alternative wasn't one we wanted to think about. After maybe an hour, maybe more, we reached a small clearing. It wasn't an official campsite, just a wide spot in the trail where someone else had cleared logs for sitting. We stopped there, finally feeling like we had some distance. We didn't hear anything behind us anymore. No branches, no breath, no steps, just the wind. We decided to rest a few hours before the sun came up. No tent, just pulled out our pads and wrapped our bags around us on the cold dirt. I didn't sleep. I don't think he did either. I just lay there, headlamp off, ears tuned to every sound the forest made. When dawn broke, the light felt like it came all at once. The sky turned from gray to gold, and everything around us looked smaller, safer. We repacked what we dragged out, hiked the last stretch of trail in the daylight, and made it to the car by late morning. The rest of the drive back to town felt quiet. I remember the sound of the tires on gravel, the first sign of pavement, and the sudden shock of seeing other people again. Families at trailheads, joggers on the road. It felt like we'd stepped out of something no one else saw. We never went back to retrieve the rest of our gear. We reported it to the ranger station. They told us it sounded like a mother and older cubs, and that she probably just didn't see us as a threat. That it wasn't common, but it happened. For weeks after that, I'd wake up to sounds in the night, even in my own bed. The shuffle of a tree outside, the creak of the floor. I'd flash back to those eyes in the dark, the way she just stood there, not scared of us at all. It didn't stop me from backpacking again, but I carried that moment with me, realizing that out there, nothing follows a script. You can do everything right, follow every rule, and still find yourself eye to eye with something that doesn't play by them. And when that happens, the only thing you can do is move. Move slow, move smart, and hope you're not the one that breaks first. It was decades ago now, but I remember every detail of that trip like it happened last night. It was my first solo backpacking trip, and I had picked a spot deep in a national forest that I had read about in a guidebook. It wasn't one of those well-known, popular trails either. It was one of those underused, lightly marked footpaths that hadn't seen a trail crew in years. That was part of the draw. I wanted solitude. I wanted to prove to myself I could handle it. I was young, had just bought my first proper backpack, a small stove, a cheap bivy sack, and a used frame pack I'd scored at a garage sale. I parked my old beater car at a gravel turnout off a 2-lane road that barely had a shoulder. There was no real parking lot, just a signpost with a rusted, bullet-holed placard naming the trailhead and warning of seasonal flooding. The forest on either side of the road was thick, dense hardwoods mixed with pine and spruce, and the trail itself was almost swallowed up by undergrowth. I remember hesitating a moment, standing there with the pack already on my back, wondering if I should really go through with it, but I pushed forward. The first day was uneventful but tiring. The trail was more overgrown than I expected, and I had to duck under fallen branches and sidestep washed-out sections that hadn't seen maintenance in years. The weather was decent, cool, and cloudy, which made the walking bearable. No blinding sun, just gray skies and a light breeze that whispered through the trees. I didn't see another soul all day. No hikers, no campers, just some squirrel chatter, a few birds, and once the distant thumping of a woodpecker. That first night, I found a spot on a ridge above a little creek. It was rocky and not level, but it was the best I could do before the light started fading. I didn't bother making a fire, too much work, and I didn't want to risk smoke drawing attention. I ate a cold dinner out of a packet, stretched out in my bivy sack, and fell asleep with the sound of the creek trickling down below. It wasn't the best sleep, but I made it through the night without issue. The second day, I hiked deeper in. I had no real plan. I just wanted to go until I felt like stopping. That day's walk was mostly downhill, winding through old-growth forest with moss-covered logs and little hollows where the ground dropped out into shallow ravines. I startled a couple of deer early on, saw the white of their tails flicker through the brush as they bounded away. I passed an old beaver pond and some scat I couldn't identify. I took it all in like it was part of some private world I was lucky enough to get a peek at. But I pushed too long that day. I didn't keep a close eye on the time. The clouds had thickened, and the woods were dim by mid-afternoon. By the time I thought about stopping, the light was already dropping fast. I scrambled to find a spot that was flat and dry. I didn't have a tent, just that bivy sack and a foam pad, so it didn't need to be big. Just something level and out of the wind. Eventually, I settled on a small clearing tucked between a few stands of young birch and oak. It seemed fine in the failing light. I could barely see 10 feet in any direction, but the ground was soft and free of rocks and roots, so I dropped my pack and laid out my things. I ate quickly. It was getting cold. I didn't make tea or anything hot. I just wanted to get into the bivvy and let my body warm itself up. I didn't even take the time to look around properly. I was just focused on getting horizontal and trying to sleep. First, it was quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Just that heavy stillness that creeps in after dark in deep woods. No wind, no insects. The kind of silence where your ears start making up noises just to fill the space. Every creak of a tree sounds like a footstep. Every rustle like an animal sniffing close by. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head. And then the owl started. Came out of nowhere. A single sharp screech that cut through the silence like someone had dragged a rusty nail down a metal door. I sat bolt upright in the bivvy, heart hammering, trying to figure out what the hell I just heard. I knew it was an owl, at least part of my brain did, but that didn't stop the fear from flooding through me. Kept going. Screech, then silence, then screech again. Not close enough to be in the tree above me, but not far either. Maybe 50 feet away, maybe less. It's hard to tell in the dark. The sound didn't echo. It just stabbed through the air, raw and alien. Even knowing what it was didn't help. It's a noise that feels wrong, like something trying to imitate a scream but not quite getting it right. It went on like that for almost half an hour. Intermittent screeches, just far enough apart to keep me from relaxing. I start to drift again. Then screech. My nerves were shot. Every part of me was on edge. I wasn't in a tent. I didn't have walls. Just a thin piece of fabric between me and everything else in the forest. I kept telling myself it was just an owl. Just an owl doing what owls do. But that kind of logic doesn't go very far when you're out there alone. When the owl finally stopped, just went quiet with no warning, I thought maybe I'd get a chance to sleep. I rolled over, heart still beating fast, and tried to focus on my breathing. Count seconds. Anything to get back to something close to calm. But the silence didn't last. I heard something else then. A heavy exhale. A sharp snort. Then the sound of something big stomping through dry leaves. I froze. It was close. Closer than the owl. 20 feet, maybe less. I couldn't see anything from inside the bivvy. I could just hear it. The huffing, snorting, the occasional stamp of a hoof. At first I thought bear, but the sound wasn't right. Then it hit me it was a buck. A rutting deer, all worked up, probably following a scent trail and agitated as hell. I'd heard about them being aggressive during rut, especially at night when their senses are on high alert. The thing paced around for a while, circling, snorting, breathing loud. Every stomp sent a jolt of fear through me. I stayed dead still. I didn't even shift my weight. I kept expecting it to crash right into me, maybe trample me by accident. It must have known I was there, but maybe the bivvy looked like just another rock or stump. Or maybe it just didn't care. After what felt like forever, the noises started to fade. It wandered off, crashing through the brush, eventually disappearing into the night. I didn't sleep after that. Not a second. I laid there wide-eyed until the sky started to lighten. The sounds of birds returning, the faint glow of pre-dawn. I waited until it was full light before unzipping the bivvy and crawling out. And that's when I saw it. I had pitched my camp, my stupid last-minute light-fading camp, right at the junction of not one, not two, but 3 deer trails. Clear as day. You could see them, narrow paths worn through the underbrush, all converging right where I decided to sleep. No wonder the buck had been so close. I had parked myself right in the middle of his turf, like laying down on a rural highway and being surprised when something came barreling down it. I stood there, shivering from the cold and leftover adrenaline, and realized how badly I'd misjudged the spot. I wasn't thinking clearly when I set up. I'd been rushing, trying to beat the dark, not paying attention to what the land was telling me. The forest always leaves signs if you know what to look for. I just hadn't looked. The rest of the trip went fine. I didn't run into anything else that intense. But I never forgot that night. Not the screech owl, not the buck, not the feeling of being completely vulnerable under a canopy of trees with no walls, no backup, and no way out but through. After that trip, I started paying way more attention. I studied trail signs, learned about bedding areas, feeding spots, animal tracks. I never rushed camp setup again, even if it meant stopping hours before sunset. I carried a real tent after that. I still go out solo even decades later, but I'm never careless about it. That night taught me that the forest doesn't care about your schedule or your comfort. It just is. And if you don't respect that, it'll remind you in ways you'll never forget. I still think about that second night, that moment when I realized I was nothing out there, just another animal on the trail trying to sleep through the dark. And everything else, owls, deer, whatever else I couldn't hear, was watching, listening, maybe even circling. It's not ghosts or monsters you have to fear out there. It's the quiet things with real teeth. The things that don't blink when they breathe heavy in the night. And the mistakes you make when you think the forest is just trees and trails. It isn't. It's alive. And it never sleeps. I was 18 the summer we made the dumbest camping decision of our lives. It was me and my best friend, Nick. We thought we were invincible, tough guys who could take on anything. We'd grown up hiking and camping around the Pacific Northwest, so by the time we hit the end of senior year, a solo trip in the woods felt like a no-brainer. It was meant to be one last hurrah before we split for college. A few nights under the stars, some fishing, a little weed, some beer we managed to score from Nick's older cousin. It was supposed to be the perfect summer send-off. We picked a remote spot near a lake we knew well. It wasn't an official campground, more like a pull-off along an old logging road that dipped into a clearing. You had to hike about 500 yards from the truck to get to the spot. No cell signal, no ranger station, no other campers. Just two cocky teenagers in a borrowed tent, thinking we had the world figured out. We got there early in the afternoon and set up camp. Pitched the tent, dug a small fire pit, set up our folding chairs by the lake, even managed to catch a couple of trout before the sun went down. The first night was chill. We sat by the fire, drank a few beers, laughed about stupid stuff, and passed out around midnight. The second day, around noon, we realized we were only about 30 minutes from a tiny town with a movie theater. Just one screen, but it played whatever was new. We didn't have much to do that afternoon, and we figured we'd head in, grab burgers, watch a movie, and get back before dark. The only movie playing that day was The Blair Witch Project. Now, this was back in the late 90s, right when the movie came out and no one knew what was real or fake. We'd heard rumors. It's real footage, they found the tapes, the filmmakers disappeared. That kind of thing. We didn't believe it, but we were curious. Two 18-year-old dudes watching a found-footage horror flick set in the woods while we were literally camping in the woods ourselves. It was probably the stupidest choice we could have made. We didn't talk much during the drive back. The sun had dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows over the narrow dirt road. By the time we parked the truck, the woods were already dark and dead quiet. Our fire pit was cold. We didn't bother trying to start it again. The air had that weird stillness to it, the kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up even when nothing's happening. Nick tossed me my sleeping bag and said something like, "Screw the tent tonight. Let's just crash in the truck." I didn't argue. We rolled down the seats, locked the doors, and pulled our sleeping bags over us. The woods were so quiet it almost hurt. I kept telling myself it was all in my head. Just a movie. Just a movie. But the images stuck. The stick figures hanging in the trees, the piles of rocks, the rustling sounds in the night. I closed my eyes and forced myself to breathe slow and steady. Sometime after midnight, I must have dozed off. I woke up to a scream. Not a distant, echoing scream. I mean, Nick was sitting up next to me, eyes wide, mouth open, yelling. It startled me so bad I kicked out and slammed my knee against the glove box. He was pointing toward the windshield, shaking, trying to say something but couldn't get it out. I turned my head slowly. Hanging from the wipers were 3 of those goddamn stick figures, tied up with twine, dangling in front of the glass. One had some mud smeared on it, and they were swinging slightly in the breeze. I remember my mouth going dry instantly. I just froze. I couldn't figure out how the hell they got there. No one else was around. We hadn't seen another human being in 36 hours. No camps nearby. The truck was locked. Nick wasn't saying anything now, he just stared. I finally turned to him and muttered, "What the hell is that?" He shook his head slowly, and then, almost like a switch flipped, he whispered, "I made them." "What?" "I made them," he repeated, "after you fell asleep. Thought it'd be funny." I didn't know whether to laugh or punch him, but I didn't get the chance to say anything, because then he said, "I heard something when I was out there that stopped me cold." He was pale, like actually pale. I was stringing the last one up when I heard something walking, fast, not heavy, but fast. I bolted back to the truck and locked the doors. "You screamed because of your own prank?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, but I think someone else is out there." Now, that's the moment where things stopped being fun. We sat in silence for a long time. I kept scanning the tree line, flipping the headlights on and off, hoping it would make me feel better. Didn't. At one point, I thought I saw something move in the distance, but it could have been a branch or an animal. Could have been nothing. But when we started hearing faint sounds, like sticks snapping behind us in the woods, we snapped. Nick started the engine. No hesitation. We didn't even discuss it. I reached for my boots, realized I'd left them at the tent. Screw it. We left everything. Tent, sleeping bags, cooler, tackle box, even my boots. He threw it in reverse and floored it. We hit the logging road so hard I thought we'd pop a tire on the rocks. Nick was white-knuckling the wheel, eyes locked straight ahead. Every so often I'd look behind us, half expecting someone, or something, to be running after the truck. Of course, nothing was there. We didn't stop until we hit the highway. Drove over 100 miles, dead silent, before we finally pulled into a gas station parking lot around 3 a.m. We sat there with the doors locked and the windows up, engine running. Neither of us said anything for maybe 20 minutes. Eventually, Nick muttered, "We're not going back for the gear." I didn't argue. We never did. Probably got rained on, rotted, and was picked over by raccoons. We never reported it to the ranger station. Never told our parents. It was like the whole thing never happened, except we both knew it had. Later, Nick admitted he'd only meant to hang up one stick figure. He thought I'd laugh in the morning. He wasn't expecting how fast the fear would set in. He heard something moving in the trees just a few seconds after he tied the last one up. He ran back, locking the doors without waking me up. Then he heard it again. Closer. That's when he screamed. Whether it was an animal or just his imagination, we'll never know. But I know this. Something changed in both of us that night. I haven't been back to that lake since. I still camp, sure, but only at developed sites with other people and never after watching a horror movie. Nick gave it up entirely, sold his gear on Craigslist and didn't look back. The Blair Witch Project was just a movie. I know that now, but fear doesn't care if something's real. Fear grabs you by the throat and doesn't let go. That night in the truck, surrounded by darkness and silence, with those stupid stick figures dangling from the windshield, we weren't pretending to be tough anymore. We weren't laughing. We were just two scared kids realizing how easy it is for your brain to betray you and how fast something you thought was a joke can spiral out of control. We learned something out there, and we left everything behind. I've always taken pride in being the kind of person who plans ahead, especially when it comes to leading beginner backpackers into the wilderness. I never want to put anyone else in a position where they feel unsure or unprepared, especially not out in the woods where it's easy for small mistakes to grow into real problems. That's why I decided to head out alone after work one Friday to scout a trail I knew well. I'd hiked it many times before, but I wanted to make sure I had updated information. Water sources, good campsites, the general condition of the trail, things change, and I wanted to be able to give solid answers when the group inevitably asked how far to the next camp or where the best spots to refill were. I got off work a little later than I wanted, but I had everything packed in the car already. I tossed my pack on, locked the car, and started walking. The weather was perfect. Early fall, just cool enough to hike comfortably without sweating too much, and the trail was dry. The forest was glowing in late afternoon light, and the shadows were already stretching across the path. Everything smelled like pine needles and dry leaves. I had about 3 hours before full dark, which I figured was enough to get in a few miles and find a decent place to spend the night. It was one of those quiet hikes where the world feels muted. There were birds, the crunch of my boots, a soft breeze now and then, but no other people. I passed a couple early on who were finishing their day hike, and after that, it felt like I had the woods to myself. I stopped a few times to make notes on my map, water flow levels at certain streams, a few downed trees that beginners might struggle with, small side trails that could be confusing if you weren't paying attention. About an hour in, the sun dropped fast. I wasn't surprised. This time of year, in that part of the forest, dusk turned to dark fast. I stopped, pulled out my headlamp, made sure it was set to high, and kept walking. I hadn't planned on hiking much in the dark, but I had everything I needed, and I wasn't too far from the stretch of trail where I remembered several small campsite pull-offs near a creek. I wanted to push just a little further and find one of those before calling it a night. Hiking in the dark is weird. It doesn't matter how familiar you are with a trail. Everything changes. Shadows take over, and your world shrinks to the small cone of light ahead of you. The trees close in. Sounds carry differently. I kept reminding myself that I was fine, that I'd prepared for this, and that I was on a well-marked trail. But even so, the forest started to feel less friendly the deeper the night got. I knew those little sites were around here. I had slept at one of them just a few months earlier. But in the dark, they all seemed to vanish. What looked like a flat clearing in daylight turned out to be sloped or rocky or too small. Every few minutes I stopped and swept my light through the trees, hoping to catch a reflection off a fire ring or a flat spot just far enough off-trail to feel like a proper camp. Nothing. That's when I started hearing the twigs snap. Not once, not in one place, all around me. At first, I told myself it was just the forest settling, maybe squirrels or birds settling in. But the sounds kept happening, and they always seemed to be behind me, or off to one side, just far enough away that I couldn't see anything when I turned my light in that direction. But close enough to feel like something was definitely there. It wasn't like crashing. It was more like careful steps, too slow and deliberate for deer, too heavy for raccoons. My pulse started to rise. I kept walking, trying to move steadily without making too much noise. I kept glancing over my shoulder. Nothing, just trees and shadows and the narrow beam of my headlamp. That creeping sense of unease settled into my chest and stayed there. I knew I was probably being paranoid. Maybe it was a porcupine. Maybe I was just spooking myself out. But the darkness had a way of making everything feel closer and more menacing. I finally made the decision that the next campsite I found, even if it was trash, was where I was going to stay. I needed to stop walking and set up before I made myself sick from nerves. 10 more minutes passed, then 15. Still nothing. I started to wonder if I'd misremembered the spots. Maybe storms had changed the landscape. Maybe undergrowth had swallowed them up. I had just about reached the point where I was going to set up in the middle of the trail if I had to, when I saw a narrow path off to the right. It wasn't much, just a faint trail through brush, but it was something. I turned onto it and followed it a few yards in. It opened up into a tiny, flat area just big enough for a single tent. The ground was soft, covered in pine needles. There were no downed trees, no major rocks. And best of all, I could hear water trickling nearby. The creek was close. I dropped my pack and took a deep breath. I'd made it. It wasn't ideal, but it was good enough. I grabbed my water bottle and my filter bag and headed down toward the creek. It was only maybe 30 feet away, and I could see it sparkling in the light of my headlamp. I knelt at the edge and started filling my bottles. That's when I noticed the ground. It looked like it was shifting. At first, I thought it was just the water moving over stones. Then I looked closer. The rocks weren't moving. The ground around them was crawling. I leaned in and realized the forest floor was completely covered in daddy-long legs. Hundreds of them, no thousands. They were crawling in clusters, climbing over one another, and it wasn't just near the creek. They stretched out from the water's edge all the way into the brush. As far as my light reached, the ground was alive with them. I froze. My stomach turned. I've never liked spiders to begin with, and seeing them in those numbers, tangled legs, fat bodies, constant motion, was enough to make my skin crawl. I took one step backward and immediately felt something brush my leg. I looked down. A bunch of them were on me, crawling up my shoes, onto my pants. I shook my leg and stumbled backward, trying to brush them off. My head net caught on a branch, jerking me sideways. I fell hard, elbow to the ground, and my bottle rolled toward the water. I scrambled up, breathing hard, clawing at my arms and chest, brushing and swatting, heart pounding like a drum. I ran back to the tiny clearing and saw more of them. They were all over my gear, on my pack, on the ground sheet I tossed out, even on the outside of my tent bag. The entire area was part of their turf. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw up, but I couldn't think. I couldn't bring myself to pick up my stuff and move. The idea of hiking back into the dark woods, away from the creek, with unknown things moving behind me and spiders crawling around, was worse than staying put. So I did the only thing I could think of. I set up my tent as fast as I could, brushing spiders off everything before I shoved it inside. My hands shook. My breathing was ragged. I didn't even put on the rainfly. I just needed to be inside something. I dove in with everything: bag, shoes, pack, water filter, and zipped it shut. I sat there in the dark, headlamp off, trying to slow my heart down. I could still see the shapes of the spiders crawling across the mesh. They weren't dangerous. I knew that, but that didn't matter. The thought of them wriggling across my face in my sleep, getting into my bag, into my clothes, it made my skin itch. I sat that way for a long time, just listening to the sounds outside. The creek, the rustling of leaves, the brush of tiny legs on nylon. I poured a few sips of whiskey from my flask and drank it straight, then a few more. My stomach stopped twisting after a while. Eventually, the warmth of the whiskey and the exhaustion caught up to me. My eyes shut on their own. I woke up stiff and groggy with the light of morning spilling through the tent walls. I waited a few seconds before unzipping the door. I stepped out slowly, expecting to find the same writhing mass of legs and bodies. But there was nothing. The forest floor was empty. The rocks were dry. My gear had a few dead or smashed ones, but nothing else moved. No webs, no signs of anything, like they'd vanished with the night. My little camp actually looked kind of nice in the daylight. The creek sparkled, birds chirped overhead, and the path back to the main trail was easier to see than it had been the night before. I packed up in silence. I didn't really want to touch anything more than I had to, but I got it all squared away quickly. The hike back to the car was easy in the daylight. No snapping twigs, no shadows, no weird noises. Just a walk through the woods like I'd done 100 times before. That experience stuck with me, though. I've done plenty of night hikes since then, but I won't camp in the dark anymore if I can help it. I want to see where I'm putting my tent. I want to know what's around me. I learned that lesson hard that night. Sometimes it's not the big stuff that scares you in the woods. It's not the bears or the mountain lions or getting lost. Sometimes it's the quiet, creeping things, the little things that crawl into your memory and stay there. And next time I scout a trail, I'll do it earlier in the day.